Our next speaker is Yanick Touchette. Yannick's research focuses on fossil fuel subsidy reform in Canada, climate change and energy policy, international climate change talks under the United Nations, climate finance and capacity building, and carbon pricing mechanisms. Yannick's recent projects include participating in the development of Morocco's INDC and the 2 guidebooks of UNFCCC negotiations for French-speaking negotiators for COP21 in Paris and COP22 at Marrakesh, published by the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. Yanick also provided strategic advice for Green Climate Fund accreditation to a regional development bank and a national development bank. These are confidential clients, that's why the name's not there. Good stuff. This effort included full support, including analysis of gaps in policies and procedures to meet the GCF requirements and the strategy to fill those gaps. Until the submission of a completed application to the GCF, Yanick is fluent in English and French. Yanick, bienvenue.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for inviting me here today, and thank you for attending. It's no small task to present after Mr. Counselor. I think he's doing impressive work at municipal level. So I'm here today to give you an introductory presentation on fossil fuel subsidies. That's one of the main issues that we are interested in at the Canadian level at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. As you will see as I go later down during the presentation, we're focusing on this issue in part because while the Canadian government just introduced a new carbon price legislation in October, on the other hand, we're still providing handouts to producers and consumers ourselves of fossil fuel subsidies. So these 2 policies are acting against each other. To begin with, I will go over a very short review of definitions of fossil fuel subsidies. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty. I just want to give you the tools to know where to look and see why sometimes it's difficult to put a pen on the issue, because there are so many different definitions that sometimes people are not talking necessarily about the same thing. So even among ourselves, it's better to be able to know what we're talking about when we go and talk to MPs about the issue. After that, we'll go over very briefly again the different ways of estimating fossil fuel subsidies. These 2 are at the international level, and then we'll go down to the Canadian level specifically from the merit letters. 2 of them includes removing or reforming fossil fuel subsidies. And then I'll go over, I'll give you the tools again to know where to look and how to understand producers' fossil fuel subsidies. Same thing for consumers. Consumers are only present at the subnational level in Canada, provinces and territories. And briefly, finally, why is it important? Because through modeling, I won't go into the modeling, but I'll just go into how we were able to determine the impact of removing those fossil fuel subsidies. In some places, they could go a very long way in reducing GHG emissions, greenhouse gases emissions. In Canada, it could go a short way, but it's still important. And then how to reform. So definitions, this is our go-to definition, our commentary definition. It's very simple. And briefly, is subsidy, or you can define it as a subsidy, you can define it as a preferential treatment, but basically it's just something that gives businesses, the government or industries or even consumers means of either producing or consuming more fossil fuels and at a deflated price, at a lower price than that it should normally cost. That definition is oftentimes based on the World Trade Organization work. Here you have on the slides the definitions. I won't read them out loud. I just want to give you an idea of what they are. WTO is the broader definition that we use. I'll tell you later on, however, why sometimes it might not be the best definition to use when you're interacting with a member of parliament or any government official, because it can bring problems to them in terms of not here at the provincial or federal level, but when they interact with their international counterpart. The OECD definition is interesting as well. This is how we build our own inventories. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, uses definition as well. You might have heard of that one in the media because it's the one. I wouldn't say it's the most current one, but it's the most striking one because it encompasses so many variables that this is the one that will give you numbers like $5.5 trillion a year of handouts to fossil fuel producers and consumers. This one gives you a big handout because it's interesting, but it's also risky at the same time. It's interesting because what the International Monetary Fund does, it uses information and data from other organizations like the OECD, Organization for Economic OECD, Economic Cooperation and Development, or even from other organizations like the International Energy Organization. But then what it does is it also tries to estimate how much the fact that we're giving handouts or giving preferential treatment to producers and consumers of fossil fuels, how this money inflates our consumption, so inflates our greenhouse gases emissions, and how does that impact on the fiscal systems of states. So for instance, if you don't collect up to $8 billion of taxes from fossil fuel producers or consumers, this has an impact on your general revenue as a government. But also, if it means that you emit more GHGs, well, it will have an impact on your environment, and an impact on the environment in terms of climate change, but also on your welfare, because more emissions mean more air pollution, means more people that are sick, means a higher pressure on your health system, for instance. So these are all intricate variables. These give you different inventories, different ways of estimating fossil fuel subsidies. The IEA, International Energy Agency, is one of the most frequent. This is the most recent estimates. You can see here, and what's interesting and risky sometimes is depending on the ways you're trying to do those estimates, you'll see here that they fluctuate a lot. But the reasons why it fluctuates that much, in part, is because the IEA compares prices, and oftentimes what happens is that you'll see a subsidy in a developing country because in the developing country, their prices at the pump will be lower than in a developed country. So they will consider that as a subsidy, but they won't capture the subsidy in the developed country because they use the price as the benchmark. And when prices go up, it looks like you have more subsidies. When prices go down, it's the opposite. So this is why you see a lot of fluctuation here. IMF, as I was saying, you see here the line is what would they consider the actual subsidy, how much money is being given directly to producers or how much prices are lower. And then all of the rest is what they call the post-tax subsidy, what I was telling you, that this is the fiscal impact, the environmental impact, and the health impact. And then here, this is just a screenshot of how the OECD does collect the data. This is very interesting because their database is live. It's updated. Oftentimes, we're participating as an organization in that process with them for Canada and for other countries. And this is a table from, you also have non-governmental organizations that collect that data, excuse me, that try to to do that exercise every other year. This one was produced in 2015. We also took part in producing the data with them. And you see here that when you look only at G20 countries, so countries like Canada, China, the US, the European Union, Russia, Brazil, you can see that those countries, just in terms of, this is also money to give. It doesn't look at the price benchmark. It only looks at how much they give in either reduce taxes or in budgetary transfer. It reaches about $70 billion a year only in G20 countries. Why focusing on fossil fuel subsidies has been done for now almost 10 years as an issue, both on the political side and the economic side of fighting climate change. But why is it more important now in Canada than it used to be? It was an issue in the past as well. But what the shift here is that since last year, since the new government came in office, removing fossil fuel subsidies is part of the mandate letters of two ministries. It's part of the mandate letters for the Minister of Finance, and then part of the mandate letter for the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. I have here the excerpts, and what you see, for instance, from the mandate letters of the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, part of the mandate is to work with the finance counterpart to identify and remove those fossil fuel subsidies. And what's interesting too, I haven't put them here, but since around 2007, a great number of countries have committed to remove fossil fuel subsidies. There's always a tricky part here because usually they'll issue a communique in which they mention that they want to remove inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. What we've been trying to do when we interact with, especially with the Canadian government, because this is our main counterpart on that issue, is to try and define what's an inefficient, well, not actually what's an inefficient fossil fuel subsidy, but what is an efficient fossil fuel subsidies. Once you've defined what can be an efficient one, what would be the reasons why one would be efficient, then you can focus on all the others and try to come up with a plan on how to remove them, either by phasing them out or by removing them right away. The organizations that committed to removing fossil fuel subsidies are important organizations. So you have, since 2007, you have the APEC, so the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, the OECD, and the G20. So organizations with a lot of clout, big producer countries, countries that are the largest emitters and the largest economies internationally. In the new context, there's a carbon price legislation that was introduced on October 3rd, if I remember correctly, the date. By that new legislation, by 2018, all of the Canadian provinces or territories will have to implement a carbon price within their own jurisdiction. That price will be $10 a ton, ratcheted up to $50 a ton by 2022. All the revenues will stay within those jurisdictions, and they can do what they want with it, either make the policy revenue neutral, as it is in British Columbia right now, for instance, where all of the money needs to be either reinvested in the economy or given back in terms of cash transfers to families. Both the main mechanisms usually here are a carbon tax like you have in BC, or a cap and trade system like you will have in Ontario from 2018, no, 2017, so next year, 1st of January, and like Quebec has had now for a few years. In that context, the way to address fossil fuel subsidies, excuse me, is in that context. I've put an excerpt of one of our most recent commentary, our Unpacking Fossil Fuel Subsidies in Canada commentary. And what we put emphasis on is it's like raising taxes on cigarettes to discourage smoking while also giving tobacco companies a tax break so that they can make more cigarettes. Because this is what we're doing. And it's even more interesting when you look at the letter that came out a couple of days ago, where 60 big companies in Canada, big businesses in Canada are saying to the Canadian government, stay on track, put a price on carbon. We want that signal to be clear. And when you look at the list, you have companies like Enbridge and Cenovus who are receiving handouts in terms of fossil fuel subsidies, but they are saying now, we want that price on carbon. So you have their support, which means that the next step is to find a way to remove the fiscal support to production in the future. Now, I've talked about consumer and producer subsidies. What I mean here is so you have ways of giving fiscal breaks, tax breaks, reduced rate to producer, for instance. Producers, anybody who does exploration for new fossil fuel reserves. Usually now in Canada, we're talking about oil and gas. Coal is not as popular as it used to be. And then any companies who, after the exploration phase has been done, goes into the extraction and refining phase. Consumer subsidies, it's any consumers, either an individual, either people like us who needs gas for cars, or a firm, a manufacturing firm who needs to buy oil and gas for its operations, or like the aviation industry, for instance, or any farmer or any softwood industry who would need important amount of oil and gas. They can, depending on the province, to receive lower rates on their fuel tax, for instance. In Canada, at the Canadian level, we only find producer subsidies. There are no consumer subsidies at the Canadian level, since the type of taxes or the type of programs that tend to give consumer subsidies will be of the subnational jurisdictions, either territories or provinces. But provinces will also have producer subsidies. So producer subsidy, Canada, only producer subsidies, provinces, both. Here's our most recent estimates. At the Canadian level, we're talking about $3.3 billion. When you only look at the federal government, $1.6 billion. And then for the rest, it's distributed across provinces. Alberta being the main producers, excuse me, being the main producing province, this is where you will find the greatest measure among provinces. I don't have the full list, but these are the 5 main producer subsidies that you find in Canada. The Canadian Development Expense is, so Canadian Development Expense, Canadian Exploration Expense, these are fiscal mechanism where producers will receive, so for instance, the Canadian Exploration Expense, all of your exploration expense can be written off. You don't pay taxes on them. Canadian Development Expense, it's a reduced rate of taxes that you pay on them. The Canadian Exploration Expense, the Liberal Party, it was included in the Liberal Party and also actually in the New Democrats Party platforms. So technically, the Canadian Exploration Expense should be easier and faster to remove, since it's been identified previously by the current government as a measure that should be removed. However, they're still not sure whether it'll be removed completely, or it will depend on whether if you have successful exploration, then you shouldn't have the credit. if you have unsuccessful exploration, you should still have the credit. I imagine both opinions are valid, but I think all of the credit should be removed. So yeah, these are the main measures. I can take questions if there are any at the end of the presentation on how those programs work specifically, but I don't want to go into that too deeply right away. Also, I've put some graphics in the presentation because these are all on our Unpacking Fossil Fuel Subsidies in Canada commentary. Actually, some of them are there, others were shared on Twitter, and they're all public. So if you want to keep sharing them, I think they're interesting because they're really simple to use and share, and they identify some of the most important mechanisms right now, either at the Canadian level or the provincial level. These are the one I'm talking about. And one of the other reasons why it's important to focus on fossil fuel subsidies, it's not only, yes, there's all of the argument about it's like giving handouts to tobacco companies while we're taxing cigarettes, but there's also the issue of these are revenues that should go into the general revenues, that the budget of either the Canadian government or provincial governments. And we're talking about significant funds. $3.3 billion can go a long way for different programs. And here, that's what we've tried to do. We've tried to identify how that money could be reassigned or redistributed to other programs, other welfare programs, to about a similar amount of money. And for instance, $3.3 billion of general revenues would be the equivalent of 260,000 students in Canada that could see their tuition fees reduced or removed. Or 6 million days of hospital beds. Or just a cash transfers to Canadians, as is done in British Columbia with the carbon tax, and as will be done in Alberta with the carbon tax that will be introduced next year, in 2018, excuse me. No, next year and fully introduced in 2018. Or, and that's an important issue here, and that's probably the next, I think this is one of the next avenues of research that would be important, is that money could probably be reinvested in training programs, because it's important not to just remove fossil fuel subsidies. For instance, if you see that they can, in Alberta, they can have a significant impact on the job market, and then just say, we'll remove them and period. If you remove them, you need to be able to develop a program and see how that will have an impact on workers, and then how to train those workers. It's good to say, well, we'll just take the money and train workers, but how do you do that? I think is the important next step. So we have the what, but we need the how. And very briefly, so I've given you a portrait of the producer subsidies, both at the Canadian and provincial levels. In Canada, there are 7 or 8 measures that are remaining. If you want a full list, and if you want a high-level explanation of how they work, these are the most recent recommendations from the Green Budget Coalition. They were released just very recently, and we have an analysis of all of them. We've made some recommendations for 3 measures that we think could and should be removed almost immediately, with a legislation schedule, and then others that should be considered to be removed in the future. And I think I didn't mention that, but there's already, that's the next interesting step. There's already also a commitment from the Canadian government with the North American Summit of Leaders to remove, again, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. The question is 2025 early enough, or should the end date be 2020, for instance? If it's 2020, when should we release a legislation schedule so that the market has a good signal of when these will be removed, so that you can plan ahead. Consumer subsidies, these are at provincial and territories level. And they have a different goal. There are incentives. There can be incentives to the manufacturing industry. It can be also programs to offset the impact of, for instance, in Northern Ontario, there's no transit system, or there's in some regions you don't really have a transit system because the distances are so large, so that you will have it's possible sometimes that you'll have a reduced rate on the fuel tax because people don't really have different options. Whereas in a city like Ottawa or like Toronto, you have different options, and oftentimes the fuel tax will even be higher in those areas to incentivize people to take public transit instead of their cars. But even in that context, what we do, our approach is similar to the OECD. We collect the data, we identify those measures, and then we focus on transparency, and then we interact on how we don't make a judgment call basically on those measures. We identify them, and then we interact as much as we can with the government, and we see how we could either reduce or remove a measure, and then how to offset the impact of removing it, for instance. I don't have, we don't yet have inventories of all provinces and territories, since those are still can be time consuming. Currently we have Ontario, Quebec, and Saskatchewan. I've put it here so that you can have a rough idea of what they look like. In Ontario, we're talking about just over $600 million a year. And you can see, as I was saying here, you'll have incentives for different industries, so for railway diesel, for instance, or for auxiliary equipment, which can be used by farmers, for instance, where they need, and these are lower. Whereas you can see that the most important measures will be aviation fuel, railway diesel. College fuel is the same. Sometimes it will be fuel that can be used by farmers and won't be used on the roads. And that's another interesting aspect of it, is that sometimes the fuel tax will be reduced because the initial aim of a fuel tax is not to tax greenhouse gases emissions, is to have revenues for road maintenance, for public transit, for complete streets, but not for GHG emissions. But we still identify them as fossil fuel subsidies. That's Quebec, where we're talking more about just under $300 million. And again, you can see that these are mechanisms that can have the reasons why they exist sometimes don't take into consideration greenhouse gases emissions. For instance, you have in Quebec the fuel tax reduction in certain regions, which is one of the most important measure, where you'll have the fuel tax reduced in regions or cities like Gatineau and the bordering city of Campbellton in New Brunswick, or bordering cities of American states, because you want to prevent people from fueling their tank in the other jurisdiction. And you use those fiscal instruments to, as much as possible, level the price of oil on both sides of the border. But for instance, if you look at Gatineau, more often than not, gas will be about 5 cents less expensive in Gatineau than in Ottawa because of that reduction in the fuel tax. And then again, doesn't take into consideration whether people, because they have that reduced fuel tax, whether they burn more oil or less. And if you just look at Gatineau, this has an impact about 5 cents lower in Gatineau than in Ottawa, but 15 to 20 cents lower in Montreal than in Ottawa. So if people do the round trip, well, they can just fuel their tank here in Gatineau, not fuel in Montreal, come back, and they'll pay 15 to 20 cents less in gas. And then Saskatchewan, here again, for farm activity, which is across different provinces, one of the most common measure. Rapidly, GHG impact. Why is it important? Not only for the fiscal, not nonsense, but for how fiscally doesn't really make sense to give handouts to fossil fuel producers or reduce the rate on consumers, but also for climate change, there could be a direct impact of removing those subsidies. At the international level, my colleagues produced a study in 2015 with very complicated modeling. They've come up to the conclusion that within 20 countries, countries such as Vietnam, Argentina, Russia, if you were to remove fossil fuel subsidies in those countries, based on their current greenhouse gas emissions, in 2020, they would emit about 11% less emission just by removing fossil fuel subsidies without not taking into consideration any other measures that they can have in place right now that they plan to put in place, but just by doing that. And if they were to only take 30% of that money and reinvest it in energy efficient policies or in renewable energy policies, that reduction would be 18%. In Canada, the study dates a bit more, so production level are different, but we did that in 2010, removing fossil fuel subsidies in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Newfoundland and Labrador, the main producer provinces in the country. GHG emissions in Canada would be reduced by 2% between 2011 and 2010. But it will also have an impact on production of 5%. As I was saying, then you'd probably have to put in place programs to mitigate this impact on workers. And that leads me to reform. I won't go into all of the items here, but basically every time we produce a commentary or analysis on a province or any government, either in Canada or internationally, we also make sure to identify those mechanisms to mitigate the impact on either workers if it's producer subsidies, or on low-income households or middle-income households, for instance, if it's consumer subsidies, because those people will see a difference. And if it's in Northern Ontario, for instance, where it's a low-income family who has no other options than taking their car to work every day, how do you mitigate the impact? Is it by giving them direct cash transfers or giving them a credit on a lower emitting car? And you see here all of that. You can either target fiscal mechanism, all economy mechanism, direct sectors of manufacturing or softwood, household or social welfare programs, or the environment directly. And that was it for the presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yanick. We do have a couple of questions. Kathy will ask the first one here.
Sorry to pull rank, everybody. Thank you, Yanick. This was really important for us going forward. This is one thing that we will really be focusing on in the next couple of years. So thank you for drilling deep with us. I have one question. So we're citizen lobbyists, but as expert lobbyists, what sort of lobbying have you done of the government, just so we know that going forward?
The main avenue here is the Green Budget Coalition. I can't remember right now the exact number, but we're a few, I think it's I won't give you a fictional number. I have a blank right now, but we're quite many organization, environmental and governmental organizations across Canada, and we focus on carbon pricing, on water pollution, and on fossil fuel subsidies. And fossil fuel subsidies is part of the recommendations each year. Then we have lobby days with the government, where MPs come, ministers come, and they focus on the issue. So we have interaction with them. And since last year, there's a bit more dialogue. So we've been interacting with mainly with finance and environment, because these are the two governments where this is part of their mandate. Also with Natural Resources Canada, because they're trying to shift. Well, they want to shift eventually from oil and gas to renewable energy. This is I think this will probably be a huge task for them, because this is a complete shift from where the ministry has been focused in the past to a complete new shift. So I think these would be the three main government to interact with. We do, and the GBC document, I think, is really the flagship one to see how to interact with them as well, because after going back and forth with the government during the drafting phase, we've changed the tone, we've changed the type of, just actually the wording that we use. We've introduced in there the legislation schedule, for instance, because if you just tell them remove subsidies by 2020 or by 2025, the response will be okay, but how, what, which? Whereas if you say, well, these are those that the ones that we think A, are the most important, and B, are also fairly easy to remove, well, introduce a legislative schedule in budget 2017, for instance, saying that that number 1, 2, 3, 4 will be removed by X date, and then in budget 2018, introduce a new legislative schedule with other measures. And there's the debate between, is 2025 too late, is 2020 too early? But just focusing on a schedule and on the specific measures, I think that we have it better here when we use that language and use that approach.
Thank you. Laura?
Hi, thank you. Really insightful presentation. I have a question whether or not you've quantified the monies that governments directly use within the government to try to promote fossil fuels. For example, I live in British Columbia, and we have a Ministry of Natural Gas Development, and our Premier actively travels trying to promote the LNG industry. So wondered if that has been done.
It's been quantified in the past, not by my organization. Excuse me. I know that there was a lot of media attention in the past, primarily from the former government. What we do, I think it's really an arbitrary decision, but we decided to really focus on the fiscal instruments that are given to which producers have access, as opposed to the type of promotion the government does, which I think, though, is one area of focus that should be tackled. But I think there are two different audiences within the government. So we've decided to really just go with what producers receive directly, because there are two different dynamics as well. You have promotion from the government so that people are open to the idea, and you have fiscal instruments where exploration and production will be inflated because of that money. And the more you have exploration, technically, the more the value of a company goes up. So the more you build sort of a bubble, if you know that in the future, they won't be able to extract those reserves.
Thank you, Jerry. Yanick, thank you for your presentation. It clarifies a few points for me. I agree with Kathy that dealing with the fossil fuel subsidies in the next couple of years is probably as important as carbon pricing because they're not mutually exclusive. My question to you is a little bit as an edge to it, because I get the impression that the Liberal government is very slow to react to the issue of fossil fuel subsidies. And the reason it's slow to react to it is because it wants some buy-in by the oil sector, by the fossil fuel sector on carbon pricing. Now, am I being totally cynical as I get older, or can you address that issue for me? You didn't understand the issue? Turn this way.
Yeah, sorry, with the speaker turned around, I couldn't hear you. Excellent question. Honestly, I couldn't tell you, though. I have no idea. But no, I think that it's really, it's an issue that's been promoted both at the Canadian and international level for years now. But I think, as we've seen with the presentation from Mr. Counselor, there can be a lot of inertia, and I think that's more what we see here. It's and especially since most of them are not direct, they're not grants or they're not subsidy per se, they're fiscal instruments. So it needs that you would need to reform the Income Tax Act, for instance. You would need to reform and then sometimes provincial measures interfere with federal measures. So in terms of buy-in, I'm not sure. Excuse me. It could be a reason, but I think that personally, I think the main reason is more inertia than buying from the producers. And there's the whole question also of, and I think that will be the next thing we'll need to tackle, is the whole question of just production bluntly. We're producing country. Some provinces, British Columbia with natural gas, Alberta and Saskatchewan with oil. Part of their economy rely on producing. So I think that we still want to see that level of production. We haven't made this switch yet to reducing significantly production. So as long as you don't necessarily reduce production that much, are you going to tackle as fast the fiscal instruments that promote production? I think those two are going hand in hand. And for instance, one of the measures we're focusing on the most is the accelerated capital cost allowance in British Columbia. Well, it's a measure that was introduced in 2015, and then that was put again in the budget in 2016, so the first mono budget. And it's a Canadian level measure, but it was introduced about at the same time as new production was kicked in British Columbia for liquefied natural gas. So we're still seeing new instruments that are being introduced to promote production in different parts of the country. So as long as we have production incentives, just in terms of production, we'll have those fiscal incentives to make production more attractive.
Thank you. Last question.
A great presentation. I hope that we can use some of your slides that are fantastic. Jim Carr and the Liberals have effectively continued fuel subsidies to at least 2024. I think you would agree. And their argument, of course, is that there's too many jobs to be lost. The industry's been hard hit by a glut of oil in the market and the prices. If you're talking about 2% of it being created by this industry and you're only dropping at 5%, they're probably looking at the balance of their political risk and losing those jobs. So I'm wondering, supposedly the Conservatives spend $9 billion on green initiatives, although we don't know where. Could we not think about matching subsidies to the green industry in the interim?
That's part of the how reform, yes. And I think that currently that's unfortunately that's one of the some of the research that's lacking, or the information that's lacking. We often hear, well, just price or remove subsidies and then train workers for train engineers or even oil rig workers to switch from the oil industry to the renewables industry. But how do you do that? How long will it take? If it's in Fort McMurray, will you really have a new renewable industry in Fort McMurray in 5 years? Or will you have to relocate whole families? So how do you do that? Do you force some of them to just relocate? Or do you only take, you only train the volunteers? If you're 45 years old, do you really want to train for a new whole industry? So I think this is the how that we're lacking, because yes, if you remove $1.6 billion in just Canadian level subsidies, plus the 1.16 in Alberta, and you use all of that to train workers, then it's almost $3 billion that you have for training them. But how do you do that is, I think, really the challenge here.
Yanick, thank you very, very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
Great presentation.
Thanks, everyone.
On behalf of Citizens Party, merci beaucoup.